Welcome to another installment of LOGOS, McLuhan among the Gnostics. I've been creating this series to fundraise for my upcoming trip to Boston. I'm going to help aid in the fight for our collective freedom at Libra Planet 2023. Many thanks to Duncan, Gi, Leon, and Dimitri. With their help, I've got a place to stay for the trip. More on that later. Thanks again. Last week, I promised you an installment titled Embodiment. Well, that's not going to happen, because 3,000 words later, I'm still not there, actually. You have to forgive me, as this series follows the flow of how it seems to me the story must proceed. That said, let's start on part 3, which I'm calling Prufrock. Last time, we considered Wyndham Lewis's merger of the Time School with the approach of the Space School. Lewis, like the anthropologists from which so much of his work derived, immersed himself in society without becoming a part of it. All the better to use society unapologetically and unflinchingly as a substance for his art. In his book, The Mechanical Bride, Marshall McLuhan found several analogates of the Lewis type in fiction. It's a little section right in the middle of the book. In order of historical occurrence, McLuhan's story starts with Lord Byron, the Romantic poet, as the residue of aristocracy. Byron abhorred the commercialism of industrial culture and the reduction of human life to mere mechanism. McLuhan first delineates in this essay the mind-body split in The Mechanical Bride. At least amongst this section. Byron, McLuhan says, is an exemplar of, quote, a whole tribe of early 19th century Hamlets, end quote. In a criticism of Hamlet, T.S. Eliot identified the play's primary weakness as Hamlet having gone too far, much too far, into existential angst and emotion than anything that Shakespeare managed to put into the story so as to justify. The weakness, said Eliot, was overlooked not only because few critics would ever dare say a word against Hamlet, but because nearly all literary criticism of Hamlet, the play, seldom discussed the play. Critics of Hamlet were nearly always engrossed singularly with dissecting and analyzing Hamlet, the character. Eliot is kind of acting like he's the only one who was actually analyzing the play as a whole. By Eliot's reading, Hamlet is a character too large for his own story. Perhaps now this presents to us a familiar human face of that otherwise all too abstractly named conception, mind-body split. Byron, Lord Byron, the poet, was an exemplar of the 19th century Hamlet. Quote, the bewildered man of exasperated nerves and confused sensibility, affecting to be blighted by an excess of thoughts and of experience, as McLuhan, end quote, as McLuhan put it in his class notes from the 1940s when he taught English. And excess of experience here, meaning a young person affecting to be tired, weary of life, having seen it all. An old soul, resigned to know their naive years, perhaps their best years, are over. Oh, and that nothing changes for them onward except maintenance in the face of a gradual decline, nostalgia, perhaps the endless Manichaean struggle against one's timeless enemies. Oh, as it so happens, I'm going to a birthday party for a 25-year-old tonight. Yeah, as well. To continue, McLuhan continues there, as he would have for his students. Quote, the habit of rumination is the result of a separation of thought and of feeling. These men think and feel by turns, as it were. They conceptualize their emotions and emotionalize their conceptions. This has been called the disintegration of that unified sensibility which one finds in Andrew Marvell, Alexander Pope, and Austin. Jane Austen's thoughts are never found in separation from a delicately organized mode of perception and feeling, and her feelings are everywhere irradiated by thought." End quote. The bewildered soul of exasperated nerves, affecting to be blighted by an excess of thought and experience, takes many forms, all of them sharing, though, in this thinking and feeling by turns, which McLuhan discusses in the notes for his English curriculum as he was teaching it in the 1940s. This unstable mode of alternating feeling and thinking was described by T.S. Eliot in the essay wherein he originates the phrase dissociation of sensibility. Eliot writes that there are, after the metaphysical poets of the 16th century, at least in English poetry, you understand, later generations following these poets, like later generations of poets seem to have been, later generations of poems seemed to have been written out of hindsight. Poets, after the metaphysicals, were inspired by l'esprit de l'escalier, or staircase wit in English. This is a phrase from France meaning someone who's embarrassed, at a loss for words, leaving a party, going down the stairs, and then halfway down thinking, "Oh, that's what I should have said. Why didn't I say that? Right? It's a person who dreams of running back up the stairs or finding a time machine to go back and just fix the social situation that they were just in, to undo their shame. L'esprit de l'escalier. Now, in contrast to the old soul, the Byronic sort just described, this victim of perpetual social frustration hasn't even a front to put up. That's the sort of character Prufrock is, J. Alfred Prufrock, in Eliot's famed poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, written in 1910 and published in 1914. My last video is a little inaccurate on the dates there. Prufrock is so fraught with self-destructive, pitiable over-analysis that the one single line of the poem most people remember, I've found when I brought it up in discussion, is, quote, "Do I dare to eat a peach?" End quote. Like, dude's nerves are so fried from worrying, like, that eating a peach could somehow bite him in the ass, right? This line echoes a question asked earlier in the poem. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions which a minute will reverse. End quote. Prufrock carries in perpetuity the worry of someone who has no idea what will result from his next action, and who has only ever felt pain and humiliation from every groping tentative step forward in life. Someone whose experience teaches neither their mind nor their body any coherent or consistent form of being in this world. We say that we learn from our experiences, but Prufrock has only experiences and no learning but humiliation. Such a person is full to the brim, though, of memories and stories and experiences of their constant being in such a state. Their memories overwhelm, but don't fit together in either continuity or by common measure of intensity. Their memories and their stories and errant bits of advice which might guide their thoughts and actions are discordant, contradictory, out of relative scale, of uncertain relevance to any particular situation, and non-existent in a self-aware way. As the lines from the poem read, "Do I dare disturb the universe?" suggest it's not only their own risk which is being taken, but the risks which one's potential actions impose onto others, or, of course, more improbably, because they're so out of scale, the whole world. Ideally, we saw, McLuhan thought that the ideal integration of self, body and mind, thought and feeling, was last exhibited within English literature as a matter of inherited cultural tradition in the prose of Jane Austen. She had sense and sensibility, we might say. The way that she, as an author, penetrated and portrayed and animated all of her characters and their interrelations. Not until modernism, his curriculum goes, like over 100 years later, did English again learn to appreciate the metaphysical poets and begin writing works where thought and feeling were unified again. It's not a different kind, though. It's worth contrasting Austen's writing with those of Wyndham Lewis. The great novels of both authors evince proof of some unity of perception, a simultaneity of thinking and of feeling. Lewis, while being an astute observer of character, was no Jane Austen. Just to me, Jane Austen's characters feel like a part of her own world, the one she lived in. Lewis's characters are always either like clearly himself or are part of another world, which his self-representative character merely has to exist in and explore. Other modernists go even deeper into such feelings of alienation. The state of technical progress, not to mention of 2 world wars and the societal awareness of knowledge of espionage and spying and effects of microphones and totalitarian culture ratting out your neighbor's suspicion of strange ideologues, wars on the streets. All right, unity of feeling in such a social predicament led many to paranoia. Thinking and feeling in unison isn't exactly a pleasure in our new world of covert electric intrigue. There's a great book by Professor Andrew Gatke called Modernism and the Machinery of Madness. Came out like just a few years ago. It's fantastic on this very topic and actually features a whole chapter on Wyndham Lewis. The unbearable pathos of Hamlet is not a stable posture to hold against an entire culture. After the printing press, Newton, Machiavelli, contract law, industrialism at large, commercialism. The stable constitution is closed off, detached. Few could become Jane Austen, who, as an aristocrat, had what we're calling for this series LOGOS, owing her training and study in the culture of society which was being eaten away from the bottom up. One radical form of new unification of being then is that of the detachment of Lewis. McLuhan came to characterize and adopt and recognize the evolution of that character to make it something to be put on in the character of the sleuth. I wish I had a prop. The sleuth. Here's how early McLuhan the English professor, is laying out the situation. Any sense of human scale, perception, and proportion in art which might be inherited by tradition ended with the last generations of aristocrats still tutored in the then dying tradition of classical culture. Think Lord Byron, Jane Austen, Alexander Pope. With the Enlightenment, rationalism and industry and commerce and all the rest of the modern post-industrial or industrial situation became constitutive of the world and its culture. What remains then for us, lost in that whirlpool, is sleuthing, the hunt. McLuhan had already spent a great deal of time researching the techniques of the French symbolist poets, owing largely to their great influence on the English modernists. The French symbolists, starting with Baudelaire, had in prior turn been greatly influenced by an English author, an American, actually, namely Edgar Allan Poe. Poe, McLuhan points out again and again throughout his writings over the decades, had invented the modern detective, the sleuth, with his character Dupin. Poe was quite candid in revealing his method, which was that of beginning with the desired effect of his art, and then working backwards to find the precise circumstances and causes to bring that effect about. That's how a mystery story is written. The author must know how it ends, who did it, before beginning to write the opening towards the end. Thought backwards. This loose faculty of perception here is key. Artists must become like the ideal detectives of fiction, dispassionate, and ruling nothing out as irrelevant. The notion of high art, as in the time school here, is irrelevant. There's nothing beneath the artist for inspection and use. The artist might not like what he's looking at, but it's not beneath him to investigate thoroughly. The macabre, or the lowly, or the disgusting, or the commonplace and popular, vulgar, is worthy of contemplation and understanding within its scheme. Here, then, we can compare the difference between, again, to use, these are somewhat arbitrary exemplars drawn just out of McLuhan's corpus, Jane Austen and Wyndham Lewis. Austen was fighting from within the long tradition, albeit one finally dying out. Within the classical tradition, one inherited from medievalism, right? The Western tradition, which persisted for centuries, right? Austen, as an aristocrat, was living, was tutored, was brought up within us, an education rooted within classical studies. Lewis, from the other side, from our side of the story, was examining with the eyes of a sleuth, detecting the world anew by clues, with a perception honed for that purpose in a world which granted easy means of knowing or sensing the greater whole, the whole of yourself or the whole of reality. Between Austen and Lewis, remember, lay, Darwin plucking us, throwing us, let's say, into a long line of descendants of evolution out of animals. Einstein ripping us from a sense of the stability of time and space, right? That's between Austen and Lewis. As McLuhan's later career was built on establishing, also between the two lay the telegraph, the daily press, and the radio, like mass media. What a world, then, now, for the modernist artist as sleuth to be poking their nose into. Let's switch gears for a minute. One of McLuhan's guiding lights regarding the nature of art during the 1940s was Jacques Maritain, a French Catholic scholar who, McLuhan was always proud to point out, had somehow broken out into the mainstream of pop culture in his day as a public intellectual, in a way which few other Catholics had. Maritain had studied under Henri Bergson. There's that name again, Henri Bergson. Maritain was one of Bergson's best students in Paris at the Sorbonne, but converted to Catholicism upon his first encounter with the works of Thomas Aquinas. One facet of Maritain's appreciation of post-Enlightenment European culture was what he termed an angelism, which is sort of snuck into Western being with René Descartes. This angelism is another formulation of what Eliot, separate and apart, had called a dissociation of sensibility, and what we here are talking about as the mind-body split. What McLuhan was calling, thinking and feeling in turns, but not at the same time, right? And whatever you want to call it, in all cases there is a particular perception of reality, culture, the world, time and space, which leaves one's immediate embodied situation in the here and now behind, or ahead of one for future contemplation, I suppose. Regarding the modernist poets, especially Baudelaire and Mallarmé, Jacques Maritain identified and explained their method as having gone beyond the normal function of poetry as a craft, as a crafting of words, as a carpenter might make a chair. The modernists, in Maritain's telling, had developed an unprecedented method of inspiration, which involved the cultivation of a self-awareness on behalf of poetry within themselves. So it's not a self-awareness of themselves, it's a self-awareness of poetry within themselves, which is supplanting the artist's actual own ego or identity. Maritain points to Baudelaire, the first of the symbolist poets, in a retelling that Baudelaire was giving of a famous essay by Edgar Allan Poe. Baudelaire wrote, quote, It is the instinct for beauty which makes us consider the world and its pageants a glimpse of, a correspondence with heaven. It is at once by poetry and through poetry, by music and through music, that the soul divines what splendors shine behind the tomb. And when an exquisite poem brings tears to the eye, such tears are not a sign of the excessive joy. They are rather a witness to an irritated melancholy, an exigency of nerves, a nature exiled in the imperfect, which would possess immediately on this very earth a paradise revealed. Baudelaire was undoubtedly, scholarship says, influenced by Swedenborg, who was a London-based 18th century mystic. Swedenborg quite explicitly fleshed out this time school conceit of as above, though below. This idea of the time school, right? The perfection of heaven, which one can, through art and poetry, almost make real on earth for us, the fallen, right? Maritain also cites Rimbaud, another of the symbolists, Arthur Rimbaud, quoting a letter by him, which reads, "The poet makes himself a long, tremendous, and coldly reasoned dissipation of all the senses. All the forms of love, of suffering, of madness he seeks within himself, and he drains from them all their poison in order to preserve only the quintessences. Ineffable torture, let him burst to death in the spasms of things unnamed and unheard of. There will be other horrible practitioners too. They will rise on the very horizons where he goes down." End quote. Rimbaud's an interesting story. Maritain also quotes Mallarmé. Quote, he's writing in a letter to his friend Isambard, quote, "This is to make you know that I am now impersonal. Not Stéphane, you knew, but the ability of the spiritual universe to see and develop itself through what was me." End quote. Here we can witness aspects of the total self-obliteration characterized by the space school. Let's turn to an oft-quoted remark by McLuhan. He sent this to an editor of a magazine who published a criticism of McLuhan. McLuhan wrote a terse, harsh letter of reproval on July 31st, 1974, to the editor who published this piece. Quote, "Remember, I have the only communication theory of transformation. All the other theories are theories of transportation of information only. Nobody could pretend serious interest in my work who was not completely familiar with all the works of James Joyce and the French symbolists." End quote. The very next day, on August 1st, McLuhan writes another letter continuing his last one. I guess that's how pissed off he was. Quote, he, which is the author of the piece, he seems to have the usual anti-McLuhan animus that characterizes the schools of communication. That is, they are all information theory people. As people. End quote. McLuhan's study of poetry, a style of analysis which, as far as I can tell, can't even be learned in university literary studies classrooms today. I've looked around various English doctorate programs going through their syllabi. This stuff ain't taught anymore. So McLuhan's style of literary analysis led him to a theory of transformation, as opposed to the information theory schools, which teach communication as being the transportation of a message. This is something McLuhan knew all too well was the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. You got to send a message from a sender to a receiver across a channel, avoiding noise, all this stuff. It was grounded in the French symbolists and in James Joyce, who learned from them, right? The ground of McLuhan, this ground it should be no surprise by now, although it was a surprise to him in 1952, was religious. So let's continue with Jacques Maritain. In Maritain's large, complex, Aristotelian and Thomistic view of modernism, which again I can scarcely do more than to like vaguely indicate to here, artists in the 19th century had cultivated an unprecedented, radical self-effacement by which they surrendered themselves to becoming vessels to which like the larger universe dispassionately channeled itself through them, right? It's an angelism of the sort which possessed Descartes, only with a mind of its own, the spirit of poetry, of impersonal creativity becoming aware of itself within the artist. It's like some weird science fiction trope of some person encountering an alien force and becoming a vessel to communicate to a higher power or something. Let's not lock ourselves into singular interpretations here, but science fiction stories of the sort certainly came to mind in my explorations of this stuff. Right, these forces are often dangerous to these artists themselves are often in such stories dangerous to former, still merely human companions and whatnot. And yeah, while many concepts and frameworks and words or myths or examples or stories, like you might be thinking like, oh, I know what Clinton's talking about. I know what McLuhan's talking about here. You might want to let's not rush to conclusions and continue to examine the notions in their genesis in this video and in more videos, as expressed in the language and the arts with which they were being discussed in this period we're looking at. Like, we're looking at original sources here. We want the story from the horse's mouth. I'm trying to give you the stuff McLuhan was reading in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And that stuff is the story itself from the primary sources. Like in poetry, it's important not to rush to shoehorn conclusions or foist well-known labels or boxes on top of the complexities of an original source or of a new story while they're still being told. Sleuths who rush to the end of their mystery before their investigations are thoroughly completed tend to be the dupes, not the dupins. So let's continue our story in light of this intrigue. Renowned arts critic Harold Rosenberg, later of the New Yorker magazine. Is it New Yorker magazine or the New Yorker magazine? I think it's New Yorker. Well, he was like their major art critic from the 60s and 70s. Rosenberg wrote a response to Maritain in the Partisan Review, challenging Jacques Maritain's framing of this larger history of modernist poetry. Rosenberg is not a Catholic. Rosenberg suspects Maritain is twisting history out of his allegiance to the church. Rosenberg points to the muses and cults of ancient Greece as precedents to modernism, such that this channeling, which Maritain claims is unprecedented in the modernists, is not unprecedented, but is in fact the normal state of culture. Rosenberg, challenges Maritain on a lot of stuff, but he does not, however, doubt Maritain's primary premise. On the contrary, Rosenberg puts on airs of taunting and provocation, like Vincent Price or Alfred Hitchcock, like in the voice that I read it, in confirming Maritain's fears about the power of this method. Here's how Rosenberg's piece ends in the Partisan Review. Quote, "Every poet truly modern has increased the capacity of the human spirit to live and realize itself in its time. When Maritain recalls against modernism its individual casualties, he tempts us to draw an awesome contrast. On the one side, the handful of pioneers of the Dark Knight." That's the Dark Knight of the Soul, not Batman. Although, I'm sure there's some resonance there. Handful of pioneers of the Dark Knight, who left indestructible blazes for those who follow. And on the other, the thousands who deranged their senses and drained every poison in the caves and deserts of the Dark Ages, but without the intention of, or the technique of, gathering and handing on what each had gained. Modern poetry has no frontiers which it is forbidden to cross. It is serious about all formal miracles, including that of grace, since grace too is a human condition and can therefore be understood and perhaps ultimately produced at will. The direction of poetry has been set up by a faith peculiar to this age, that man will become the center of powers which, were he to sense them within himself today, would cause him to tremble before his own greatness, as Rimbaud trembled before the aspect of his seer. End quote of Rosenberg. Yeah. As is recounted again and again by modernists and McLuhan alike, the ultimate effect of such a perception, as is under discussion here, is that everything in the world, even its most mundane facets, becomes endlessly engrossing and interesting, a portent full of meaning. If only from the endless analogies which the contemplative mind can draw from a thing's likeness. And again, that's not to say it's all very pleasant. A rereading of Plato's allegory of the cave, like a translation of the original. Like, go read Plato's original allegory of the cave. Like, you probably don't know ancient Greek, but go read a good translation, not a summary. It'll be instructive on this point. At the very least, to someone with possessed by the spirit of creativity, nobody or nothing could ever, while in the state, be boring. Like, let's look at this as an explanation, one among many, of McLuhan's voracious appetite for books on so many a varied subject. It's the same appetite James Joyce had. It's encyclopedic. I'm like 32 minutes in, and so we will have more in the next video, but for now, let's consider logos as a capacity, a dexterity, a fullness, an encyclopedic capacity, and a poetic capacity to keep up with this impersonal spirit of poetic perception. To start, and let's ideate J. Alfred Prufrock. I suggest you read Eliot's poem as something of a burnout in the style which Marantain and Rosenberg are arguing over as being a victim to such a state. This series will continue. Thanks for waiting. At the same time, I'm going to be focusing on finishing and finessing my presentation for the Free Software Foundation's LibraPlanet 2023. Its convention in Boston, Massachusetts will be convening on the 18th and 19th of March. Thanks to the generosity of viewers like you, I'm going. Your sponsorship is, again, your help in this endeavor is still greatly appreciated. You can find a PayPal link here. Or you can reach out to me. But regardless, I'd like to thank you again. And please subscribe and continue to watch. I hope it's interesting. Take care.